Welcome everybody at today's seminar. My name is Martin Serholec. I'm a researcher at CERGE-EI and I will be your local host today. You are at CERGE-EI or CERGE-EI in Czech, which is a joint workplace of the Charles University and the Czech Economic Sciences. More specifically, you are at seminar of IDEA think tank, which is policy-oriented think tank of CERGE-EI. Let me first thank the strategy AB21 of the Czech Academy of Sciences, which is funding our analysis and research on research development and innovation, the part of which is also this seminar series, and who is funding us for now more than 2 years. So everything that you have heard from us over the last 2 years was thanks to this funding that wouldn't exist if not for strategy AB21. You have all seen the leaflet, the annotation, you know roughly the program. What you haven't seen, and which I owe you, is composition of the discussion panel. We have 5 excellent speakers. Jana Drlíková from the Ministry of Regional Development of the Czech Republic, Martin Kopeček, who might arrive later, from the Ministry of Finance, Lenka Kováčová from Open Society Fund, and Ondřej Profant, member of the Parliament of the Czech Republic, and then myself at the end. I have the last word, which I just always like to have in this kind of debate. It's alphabetical, but Mr. Profant will come first because he needs to leave early. So he will come first, and then we continue alphabetically. Before I pass the floor to the main speaker and introduce the main speaker, let me say a few words, just to be sure that we are all on the same page. Today the seminar is about administrative data, not statistical data collected by the Statistical Office, but primarily about administrative data collected by government and public bodies for the purpose of the government business, but which can be used on secondary for research analysis, policy analysis, and evaluation. We will mainly mean access to micro or individual level data, not aggregated, but the primary individual level information. We will talk about access to anonymized data. That means data that will conform to protection of personal data without unique identifiers and names that can be tracked to the individual persons. And that's important. We will talk a lot about merging data sets from various sources. There's a lot that can be already accessed from individual sources, but for research and policy analysis, essential is the ability to merge data sets from different sources. I will talk a little bit about it in my contribution in the panel, but merging, that's the kind of the key word of today's seminar. This is a follow-up on 2 previous events. About a month ago, we had a similar seminar about access to statistical microdata from the Statistical Office. And we will bump into this issue here and there in today's seminar as well. And a few weeks ago, we have a seminar about with EAB from Germany about good practice and evaluation implement policies for which both statistical data and quantitative data is essential. So we are kind of closing the circle now with the third issue, which is access to the administrative data in the Czech Republic. If you missed out on these previous 2 events, you can see online all the materials and even the video coverage, so you can play it if you would like to have a peek. Now let me introduce our main speaker today, Ágota Scharle, who is a labor economist, one of the founding partners and senior researchers at the Budapest Institute for Policy Analysis. Her recent work is focused on impact evaluation and design of social policy and active labor market policies, and the political economy of welfare reforms. And most importantly for today, she is one of the main proponents of the law 10 years ago introduced in Hungary. She was at the point at the Ministry of Finance. She built a coalition for the support of the law. She pushed it through the system, and she knows also everything about the implementation. So we have really a first-hand experience of the key person who made it happen in Hungary. And with these words, let me pass the floor to Ágota.
It's the first time I use this sort of a microphone. Is it okay? Not to. Thank you. Can I use this to move? No.
Probably if you switch it on, is it off?
It's off. On the side. On the other side.
Okay, thank you. Yes, it does work now. So thank you very much for the invitation and for being here. And I'm quite excited to pass on this experience to you. As I will mention it later on in the presentation, the Hungarian government have not made much use of the wonderful opportunities posed by or presented by this law. So I'm very much hoping that the Czech Republic will make more use of it than we have. And also I should just briefly stress that I did work for the Hungarian government at some point, left government in 2008, just before Mr. Orbán came into power, and now work for a very independent think tank, though based in Budapest. So I'll walk you through first briefly explaining why administrative data is useful in my mind, then I'll explain about the legal framework that was constructed in Hungary in 2007, and then come to some examples of how this can be practically used, and I have a concluding slide which summarizes the lessons that I believe could be useful for you and other EU member states. So very briefly, as Martin has already explained, the definition of administrative data throughout my presentation is that it is data collected by some government institution, tax authority or insurance fund, etc. It's at the individual level, and when we talk about linked or merged data, we mean that we link data on the same person. So for example, myself, my records in the tax authority, my records in the health insurance, and these are linked together, but without my name and anything that could point to my person. So that's the anonymization part. So this and imagine 4 million individuals within a data set in the Hungarian case, so that would be a typical linked data set, which is anonymized for the purposes of research or policy analysis. Now, why would such a data set be useful? As I'll explain or give you some examples, it has some important advantages over survey data, and also you can think of it as a sensible use or secondary use of something that you actually already have. So the administrative data recorded or collected by the public administration is there. You've already spent. We don't have the person from the finance ministry, but your country, your taxpayers have already paid for it. Why not use it in this secondary purpose as well? Because the marginal cost of doing the anonymization and of linking the data sets is actually quite small compared to the money you already spent on collecting the data. And lastly, I'm not sure how much this argument works in the Czech Republic, but actually the EU wants us to do this. So there are directives on the secondary use of public sector data, and also there's a new piece of legislation which is passed, that just came into power, which is on personal data protection, but it actually reinforces these arguments that administrative data should be used for research in an anonymized way. Now, with all these advantages, there are still, in most member states, quite strong legal barriers to compiling such administrative data sets, and this is what I'm going to talk about now. So to the legal framework. Excuse the small print. I don't want to go through these the history in much detail, just to give you a flash of how it happened in Hungary. So the Hungarian story starts in the, I should say, in the 19th century with the bureaucratic traditions of the Austrian monarchy, which we share with you to some extent, and also the history of the planned economy, which liked to collect information on the citizens. So we have a strong tradition of data collection. We want to know everything in detail. Hungary also had a quite strong tradition in its statistical procedures, which I believe some of you who were here a few weeks ago when the Hungarian expert from the statistics office came and probably explained. And then after the political transition in the 1990s, this is the legal part, Hungary established a fairly strong law on personal data protection, and for about the next 10 years or so, this has become the main barrier to linking and using administrative data. Apart from the legal barriers, there are some attitudinal barriers emerged as well, and these came from two issues. One was that in the early 1990s we had a few fairly big media scandals in which some officials, government officials, were found to be using individual data for illegal or unofficial purposes, airing information into the press, or mainly that was the issue, which created scandals, and it also generated some fears within the public administration that any handling of personal data is risky because they could get caught and quickly get into the press, etc. And there were also some attempts at the time, this is the mid-1990s, to link administrative data sets for the purposes of finding people who abuse the welfare system. So basically people who draw unemployment benefits from two counties or these sort of issues. And this was quite popular with politicians, obviously, for obvious reasons, but very unpopular with lawyers protecting personal data. And it also generated conflict in the sense that lawyers were happy with the new data protection law, and they thought that this is a big achievement of the new democratic structure. And basically any attempt that went against or that questions the integrity of this piece of legislation was very strongly met by lawyers who defended it. So this was the situation in the 1990s, and because of this history, it was very difficult to bring up the issue of using administrative data for anything other than administration for some time. And this lasted until 2002, roughly, when we had elections, and the new socialist liberal government was a bit more open to the idea, probably mainly because they were more open to new public management approaches and evidence-based policy making, so it was a bit easier to explain to them why researchers and policymakers needed this data. And more or less accidentally, a research unit was set up in the Finance Ministry in 2003, I think it was, and it was led by one of my colleagues who just got back from UCL in London, where she did her PhD, and she invited me to join her. So at the time I was just back from the UK as well, having done my PhD, and we basically held hands and then decided that we'll have to do something about this. It was a very small unit of 5 people, but we realized that being within the Ministry of Finance, we had the power to get this data. And to cut this long story short, we made some attempts to get some administrative data at the individual level in an anonymized way, and even to link the data. within the existing legal structure, and we very soon found out that this was not possible, even though we were sitting in the ministry with all the power, all the support from the minister himself. We just couldn't get what we wanted. So we decided that we shouldn't give up, and we should change the law. And very luckily, we found some colleagues in the Ministry of Interior who understood the importance of personal data protection, but they were also open to our ideas and understood why we needed this change, and basically we got together and they helped us draft this new law and press it through the government and parliament. Even so, this took us 2 years. So the first attempt, or the first discussions about what this law should, or what should be the legal solution, started in 2005, and it wasn't until July 2007 that we actually had the law passed by Parliament. So what exactly were the legal barriers that we ran into? Well, as I already mentioned, the biggest one was set in this law on personal data protection, which had two important propositions or rules. One was that any data or information held within the administration is considered public, and this implied that if you have an anonymized data set, that is also public. So there's no distinction between something secretly held by the government and something that has to be put on the website. There's no in-between situation. It's either or. And second, the rules on personal data protection set in this law are strict, or very strict, meaning that any piece of information is considered personal as long as you can trace it back to the individual it is about. And this tracing back could be, there was no definition in the law on how difficult or easy it should be. If somebody said that it was possible, then this implies that the data is still personal. So think of examples when there's a data set which doesn't have, that doesn't include anybody's name or legal address but it, for example, includes information on their employer and the amount of salary they have. And if the employer is one in like a monopoly situation or a big firm, and if only the CEO of the firm has such a high salary, this implies that such a data set, in that data set, that CEO can be identified. So in all these situations, the Hungarian law would say that data set is not anonymous because there are people in it who can be identified. For obvious reasons, this makes anonymization use of data very difficult, because if you start removing these people from the data or making the data so simple that none of these precise bits of information are still there, at one point you lose the point because the data would not be suitable for research. And this is what the UK legislation solves by saying that you don't have to make sure that the anonymization ends up with the data that's where this link with the person is impossible. You just have to make sure that it's difficult to do it. Right, but this was not the Hungarian case. And and the third bits third rule in the existing legislation, this was not in the law on personal data protection, but in the other laws governing the functioning of other state institutions, which basically said that any government institution can only process or handle personal data if they have a legal obligation to do so. And since the then existing body of law did not make the purpose of research or policy making a legal or an obligation of any public body, when you approached the tax authority or the health insurance authority asking for some piece of data to be anonymized, they could just say, sorry, I can't do it because I have no legal obligation to do this for you. I can't anonymize the data set because that would involve handling the data, and it's not one of my tasks to handle data for such purposes, so I can't do it. So this was this led to the end of those negotiations when we asked for data at the time. So basically, we understood, looking at the situation at the time, that we needed a new piece of legislation which obliged, and not only allowed but obliged government bodies to process data and anonymize data for research purposes, so that they wouldn't have this excuse of not having this obligation. Okay. Now, besides the legal barriers, there are also quite a few, what I would call institutional and political barriers to changing the law and changing the situation. Part of this came from the lack of clarity and this unfortunate past of media scandals that generally created a sense of mistrust between or among organizations and institutions holding data. They just didn't want anybody else to have it or to do something new about their data. There were also there was also lack of information on what or on how much money it cost, how much time it would take to anonymize data sets. So often the IT people would know, but the managers and executive or high-level officials wouldn't. They just thought that it would be too much time, too much money, etc. So they feared doing it. Then, in quite a few cases, we met data owners who believed that, or who felt that the quality of the data they're holding is actually probably not so good. So they wouldn't want anybody outside to learn about the quality of their data. And in some cases, for example, the tax authority of Hungary, or even the health insurance authority, they had a practice of actually selling some of their data to businesses or to for example, medical research units. And obviously they wanted that practice to be the same, so they feared that this new legislation or any change in the law would deprive them of this nice business that they had. And lastly, we also, in a few occasions, we ran into examples where the data owners didn't want to change because they thought or they knew that if somebody else could look at the data they had in detail, they would uncover unlawful practices. A case in point was the national authority that administered grants from the European Union, and because in some of their programs, especially the ones that subsidized businesses, they knew that in some occasions the businesses who won government grants were not selected on a competitive basis, but on a political basis as well. So whenever researchers asked for the data on the winners as well as the data on the losers, so that they have a control group, they would always say that we can't tell you anything about the losers. You can get the winners, but not the losers. And we knew that this was the explanation behind. Okay, there were also some barriers coming from the fact that a lot of public administrators and even some politicians just didn't understand why researchers need individual level data. I won't dwell on that because I think you know about the problem. And also we had, apart from people in IT departments, we had a lot of mistrust about the actual technique of anonymization, about this hash code and how can you really do it. And then the general problem that when we came up with this argument that we needed this data for policy analysis, this was never a strong argument because everybody knew that the government is generally not so much interested in policy analysis. So what if you don't have the data? No problem, they can still carry on. And an interesting one was the general lack of trust between institutions. So when you said you wanted this piece of legislation, a lot of people just thought that, okay, you have some hidden motive. It's, the idea that you just want this for public good just did not seem reasonable to a lot of people. So we had to fight with that as well. And lastly, and this is probably linked, this whole story of two researchers within the public administration starting this grassroots movement that they wanted a new piece of legislation. This was also fairly unusual. So even just that, I think, created some opposition. Probably, I don't know if the fact that we were both women made a difference, but probably that as well. Okay, so what did this new piece of legislation finally did? I'll tell you, or I'll explain in the next slides the actual technique of linking the data using this piece of law. But basically, this new piece of legislation says that if there is a government body or a public institution who needs some data for the purposes of research or policy analysis, they can turn to the data owner and ask for it to be anonymized. So this provides the legal obligation to public bodies to do the anonymization. Now, in order to please the data owners who were really afraid that suddenly this huge demand will emerge and they won't be able to do their own job because there would be so many demands for their data, which I should say is a legitimate concern, so I'm not saying they weren't right in fearing this. But anyway, to make sure that they're not afraid of this, the law sets different levels of rights for asking for data. So for example, the most complicated requests that involve linking data from various institutions can only be made by a small circle of public bodies. High level, it should be a minister or the head of the academy or I think the head of the National Bank of Hungary could ask for linking data, and lower ranking officials can make smaller, easier requests. And also in response to these fears that data owners brought up, the law says that once the data is anonymized, it's publicly available, which means that if somebody asks for something to be anonymized, they can say, oh, we've already done this for somebody else, here, use it. So this actually doesn't really work in the Hungarian setup because we never managed to get this searchable database, but in theory this could have worked. And then in response to the concerns of the lawyers, the law does four things. First, it sets out or it defines a procedure on how the data should be anonymized. This is what I'll explain in the next slides, using what we call hash codes. I don't know how many of you are familiar with hash codes, but the basic idea is that that a hash code it establishes a one-on-one or a one-to-one relationship between the personal information and the code itself. So it's always a unique way of producing it. So one personal piece of information cannot lead to two different codes. It's always the same one code, but it cannot be traced back to the original. So if you know the code, you won't be able to go back to the original personal information. So for example, if you used my personal insurance identifier, which is, I don't know, I think it's a 4-digit number, the code will give you another number which will always be the same, but from this other number you can't go back to identify my original insurance number. So this is set in the law that this procedure has to be used. The law also established an institution responsible for linking, for making the merging of the data sets. This wasn't a new institution, it just the law defined that an existing institution should take on this role. And this ensured that this one institution could keep track of all the requests made by various institutions, and the idea was that if you have this, there's one institution who knows about all the linking and the merging, they could prevent any institution from building such a huge big data set, which in the end becomes so big that it would be possible to identify some people within the data, which, if you think of it, is not impossible. Okay, and then the law also prescribes some quite strict rules of anonymization. So apart from just using this hash code, it also says that some of the variables in the data should be made less precise. So for the most important example is the information on residence. So the law says that I think it's the small region level. So in Hungary there are 170 roughly small regions, and the law says that you cannot give information on residence more precisely than identifying the small region, and the sample can never be over 50%. And the last one is that, which is a bad rule, I think. You shouldn't copy this. It's very unhelpful. But it says that once you have a piece of or a data set anonymized, the owner of the data set, when they created the data, they should delete it or destroy it, which implies that if one institution wants to create, for example, an increasing panel data, so one where you want to keep adding years to your panel data, you have to go back to the first year all the time. You can't just add the additional year, which is obviously very expensive and unuseful. So if your data protection lawyers are not as strict as the Hungarian ones, don't follow this last rule. You don't need it. Okay, so the practical implementation. How can you link data? In this example, we have two data owners, the health insurance and the tax authority. The middle one, the Hungarian name is NIS, is the one that's responsible for linking for merging the data, and then the gray one is us, it's the researchers. And the first step in the linking procedure is that the linking people think about a coding mechanism. So basically it's the algorithm of how to create the hash code, and they send this algorithm to the first data owner. In the Hungarian case, it's usually the health insurance people, because they have the broadest set of information. They know about everybody, kids and the adults and the elderly in Hungary. So they are the best placed for producing a sample of the population. So they send the algorithm to the health insurance people, and the health insurance people generate a sample. It usually depends on what the researchers want, but typically it's a 50% sample of the population, and they extract the personal identifier that they use for creating the merging code. For each member of the sample, they take this identifier, they anonymize it using the algorithm received from the linking agency, and they send this list of numbers. So it's only the anonymized codes that they send back to the linking people, to the middle. And then these guys send these 2 bits of information to the second authority, in this case the tax authority. So they send them this list of anonymized codes plus the algorithm. And the trick in this story is that the tax authority has this, they know the personal identifier for everybody in their records, so they can use the algorithm to create with the hash codes the anonymized codes, and then they do it for their whole registry, and then obviously they have to extract the sample, so they find the people where the anonymized code matches the list of codes they got from the health insurance people. So then they have identified who is in the sample, So basically, at this stage, both the health insurance people and the tax authority has the hash-coded anonymized identifiers for the sample in their own records. They can extract the data that belong to these people in the sample, and then what they do next is send the data with the hash codes without the original personal codes to NIS, which implies that the linking organization gets the information with this anonymized code. So they don't know the health insurance code, they only know the anonymized code. And they can, but they have the same code for the same people. So they can use this anonymized code to link the data from the two institutions. And then they can remove the anonymized codes. Actually, they could keep it. There's not much you can do with it, but for lawyers who don't believe that these codes work, you can actually drop them. And they can send the merged data to the researchers. And voila, you get merged administrative data anonymized. There's actually a second, so to refine the process, the linking body can do some additional things. So they can make sure that the data is not too big, not too rich, so that, you remember this example that, for example, CEOs with huge salaries could be still traced if the data set is big enough, so they can check for that and make some additional changes, but usually in the Hungarian case they don't, because they are IT people, not lawyers, so they're not so worried about data protection. Okay, what are the limitations of this Hungarian solution? There is this 50% rule, which is not always very helpful, but it's actually, we found that you can live with it. I already mentioned this problem that the data, once it's been transferred to the researchers, has to be deleted. So the tax authority and the health insurance people have to delete the anonymized data set. They can't keep it and keep adding to it if you ask for similar data again. There's also a lot of cleaning to be done. I'm sure those of you who have used admin data before, you know about this, that because the data set, or typically administrative data is used for official purposes, and usually there's background papers behind the digital data. The quality is not as good as researchers would want, so there's a lot of cleaning to be done. And also the process can be quite slow. Typically, with a big merged data set in Hungary, it takes at least 1, but usually 2 years from the first moment that you start asking about the data to the moment that you actually get the data. It's lengthy. Costs. I should be clear on that. Actually, it's not about. So the cost should be low, but and the cost is low. What is high in the Hungarian case is the price. Okay, so the actual cost of producing the data is typically not so huge. It may involve a few weeks of work by the IT people in the respective public bodies, but very often institutions set a high price to provide the data. The reason why is that they are in a monopoly position. They can ask for a high price, and if researchers can pay for it, or as long as they can pay for it, they do. And well, in the last issues are probably not that important compared to, for example, the Scandinavian countries. We know that if you use administrative data, for example, on the issue on information on employment, you miss out on some information on how things actually happen, because informal work is higher. And in the Hungarian case, the information on education is or tends to be limited, at least in the insurance and tax records, because these records don't have direct, so they just don't ask citizens about their education. So we only know education for people who are unemployed. But actually, this can be solved by asking for information from the education authority as well. So it's not a huge issue. Okay. So what have Hungarian researchers made of this new opportunity. I'm showing you here a few, not a few, this is probably more or less a comprehensive list of the directions research has taken in Hungary using administrative data. Probably the most fruitful area has been linked employee data, which is a popular area in research. There are also some very good papers published in high-profile journals on using data which is merging firms' financial information with trade information. The unemployment register has led to lots of studies, typically impact evaluations of various employment policies. And then another area is when we link information on students and there's kind of school and class level data. And there's work histories linked with information on health and education. I'll show you some further examples of that in a minute. And probably the most interesting area, so the first few are all exploiting the fact that you can merge different data sets and make sure that the data is so rich that you can probably never get in a survey, because you can't, asking or getting the same information from surveys would involve a 3-hour interview, which you usually cannot do. And the last one is using a different aspect of admin data, which is the size of the data set. So if you have 4 million Hungarians in a data set, you can look into very small groups of people, very specific groups. The two examples in the data are about this. The first one is this, looking at what happens to prisoners after they have left prison. And it's built on a panel data set where you see the labor market history of the prisoner before prison, and then you look at what happened to them after prison, because you have, I think, a panel of 11 years or so. This would be impossible to collect, or more or less impossible to collect from a survey. And the second one is looking at doctors and what happened to doctors, and it's using the fact that if you merge practically all the data sets that look at insurance, pensions, and health insurance, pensions, and unemployment, and trace doctors in these data, and if you find that somebody disappeared from all these data sets, you know that they have immigrated, they have left the country. And this again is something that you would, actually this one you would never be able to do on a survey based on a Hungarian sample, because the people you're talking about are not in the country. You would have to go to England or Germany or wherever to find them. This is a concrete example of a paper that I was involved with, and I just realized that I actually did this with the help of CERGE, because it was the first version was prepared on a scholarship from CERGE-EI. So thank you very much for making this possible to happen. So this is again an example for exploiting the size of administrative data, because in this paper we looked at the impact of a policy that subsidized the hiring of long-term unemployed people, and which was introduced in 2007. We used what they call the Admin 1 data set of the Institute of Economics, and we could follow people for 7 years. And we used an identification strategy where we compared the labor market outcomes for men and women aged just below and just over 50, because that was a threshold for being eligible for the policy. So anybody aged just over 50 could get the subsidy, and anybody just below 40 or 50 couldn't. And if you use such a strategy, this implies that you need a huge data set, because you can only consider people who are very close to the cutoff age around 50. Typically, in a survey sample, you wouldn't get so many people, so you wouldn't have a large enough sample size to be able to do this analysis. But in this data set, which included half of Hungary, we could still have a a few hundreds of people who were eligible and could carry on and have significant results. To mention one, so I'm not going to tell you much about the policy use of the law and of merged data, but this is an example where the Hungarian government could have used the results for policy change, because the outcome of the study was that this employment policy or this measure was only effective for people with a secondary degree. So if you had a university degree, there was not much of an impact on you. And also the policy was only effective for men and not for women. And there's an obvious policy implication. First, that the targeting of the measure should be changed, so it should only target secondary school people. And second, it should be extended and with some additional measures and incentives for women, because for them it was just that way. The policy had no impact. Okay, and yes, I should perhaps mention as well that an obvious advantage of this, in this case, of the use of administrative data was that we could do this analysis ex post. Whereas doing this on a survey basis, you wouldn't be able to do this, because you would have to have people remember back to what happened to them before the policy was introduced. Okay, and another example, this is actually a data set and a list of issues it is being used to research. This is a data set compiled by the Institute of Economics in Hungary, and it includes information from 5 different sources: the tax authority, health insurance, unemployment insurance, and the education authority. And it's a long panel of 7 years, and it includes over 4 million people, so practically half of adult Hungarians. And as you can see, the list at the bottom, it's being used in a lot of areas for research. I think I'll go to the next one because I'm running out of time. And to give you an example of where not only researchers but public bodies use this new opportunity for merging data, there is a regular report of the Education Authority in Hungary, which is tracing recent graduates. So it looks at what happened to people who just left university, if they got employed, and if so, what wage or salary they are receiving. And this authority has used this opportunity to merge data since 2011, and I think it's every second year that they ask the education data to be linked to tax data and some other information. So they also want to know if somebody is not employed because they went on to have a family or they're unemployed. And they can use this information to look at the employment and wage outcomes for different institutions, and they can tell which universities are doing better and which are doing badly. And they can also look at the efficiency of or the usefulness of various occupations or fields of study, so they can know if there's a problem with, I don't know, engineers or IT or whatever, because the salaries are increasing or decreasing, etc. And I should perhaps add at this point that this is the only use of the law within the public administration from Hungary, but this should not discourage you. The reason why is because very unfortunately, right after this law was introduced, we had Mr. Orbán coming into government, and he's simply not for policy-based or evidence-based policy making, so it shouldn't happen in the Czech Republic. Okay, and I think this is my last slide. So to sum up the lessons, I think the Hungarian case is, although it's fairly I don't think it's unique, but it's in some ways it's unusual. So I tried to look at what made it happen. So what were the factors that helped in getting this result? And the first one was probably that we were insiders. So when we started working on this law, we were sitting in the Ministry of Finance and in a fairly strong position. So I suspect that from being outsiders as researchers, it may not be that easy. So you need to convince some insiders to be on your side. Having good lawyers and open-minded lawyers sitting in the Ministry of Justice, that was also helpful. An important point was that from the very beginning we made sure that we separate this issue from these initiatives to use merging for fraud detection. And I think that was important because that brings in a whole different lot of stakeholders and increases the risk of conflict. So we made sure that we are not cooperating with those guys. And as usual, backing from the EU helped. Now, the Hungarian story also shows that the costs can be high, or the price of selling the merged data can go up quickly. I think that's a point where you probably may need to think of changing not following the Hungarian example, but thinking of ways of containing the costs or the price that the data owners can charge. And perhaps lastly, I think even though you could say that the use or the Hungarian administration has not started using this opportunity as much as they could have. Researchers have, but public administration hasn't. It still is important that we have this because it's allowed us to accumulate a lot of experience in creating these merged data sets and using them, and we will be able to use this experience as an argument once we go on with improving the law and once we try using it a bit more, because it can be useful for reducing the attitudinal barriers. Because we have shown that we've shown that if you give data to researchers, they use it responsibly, they don't misbehave, and you can trust them to have these data. So we hope that this will make it easier to make further amendments and improvements to the law and also to the applications and the use of the law once we have a government who will be interested in using such data for not only for research but also for policy analysis. And I think that was my last point.
Thank you, Ágota. Let me now go straight into the panel. I asked 5 people that I already mentioned to give a kind of kick off the discussion. Each roughly for 10 minutes. It can be a bit shorter if you want, but please don't go for more than 10 minutes because then we need also some time for the floor, open debate. So let me now ask Mr. Profant to start with his first intervention. Yes. How do I start the PDF? I never use PDF. Should I click on this? Or
something.
F5 or something like that?
Alt L. Or I think it's Control L. In Windows. Views. Yeah. Full screen.
Okay.
Yes, please.
Okay, I will start. Good afternoon.
If you wave, I can move.
Okay. Next slide. Okay, who I am. My name is Ondřej Profant. I am co-founder of Czech Party, which is party which policy is basically evidence-based policy. Last few years I have been a member of Prague City Council. I am co-founder or godfather of the Prague City-wise Open Data Portal. It's city-wise because it's a lot of organization of the main city are involved in this portal. And now I am a member of the parliament, and I am chairman of a committee of e-government. Okay, next. And now I have some summary of current situation in Czech Republic about the data. As I heard the previous presentation, I think we are in the 19th because we have a very strict privacy policy, the law 101, and it's very strict, I think, but it's not the only problem. I think with this law we can work, but there is no creativity between employees of state. Okay, who collected data in the Czech Republic? There is some data from the strict law agendas like cadastre of real estate, electronic prescription, registration of sales, and we have základní registry is basic database of people, rights, obligation, and addresses for all state. Every bureau can use it to anonymize their data. The data are up to date, and it's pretty clever. It's something like X-Road in Estonia. And we have Ágota Scharle. It's electronic post service, but it's not mail, and it's very old school, I think. I think this is the main agendas where is some statewide data. The next slide, yes. The next institutions who collect the data are Czech Statistical Office. I think it's pretty clear. And Institute of Health Information and Statistics of the Czech Republic. They have health and medical care data. It's special. Okay, next slide. And we have data in self-governments, like planning and developing data, traffic data, security. And of course, last but not least, we have open data in some sectors, but it's only very small part of data in public sector. Okay, and who works with the data, or is there any work with this data? I think the answer is no. It's no in majority of cases. Main excuse of our bureaucrats are lack of experts to data analysis, to anonymization, and so, and the privacy. Yes, it's the legislation, and it's the excuse. They don't understand the difference between statistic data, anonymized data, and the data with the privacy information. it's a real problem, I think, in the data usage in our state. But there are some exceptions. Yes, the Czech Statistical Office has macroeconomic data like GDP, agricultural data, demographic data, elections, and a lot of data sets. But I think it's only the basic data. It's the Austria-Hungarian traditions of bureau, not some innovation. Yes, it's same like before 100 years. Yes, we have Institute of Health Information and Statistics of Czech Republic. It's more interesting. It's relatively new. They have interesting data. They can work with this data, and they do this work. It's not well known, and I think it's a good example of working with data in public sector. And they also have some open data. And in the municipal level, we have Prague Institute of Planning and Development. It's about the urban development, the city statistics, and it's a very professional institution, which is good with work and collect the data about the city. But I think it's only institution of this type in all Czech Republic. In other cities are smaller institutions for urban development and haven't data, haven't so much good data. For example, the Institute of Planning and Development have big open data, geoportal, and stuff like this. Okay. Okay. Data. Yes. From the point of view of the public sector, there is they using data only according to law, not some creative way. There is no real response to collecting data. For example, we can have notification about expiration of citizen ID and etc. But we haven't. Why? It's not technical issue. It's not law issue. It's it's only the mental setting of the bureaus. And bureaus don't have enough data analysis. As in many cases, they haven't access to their own databases. It's true. And in this situation, we cannot work with data. Okay. We have, I think, we have three main challenges in this sector. Learn how to work with data and respect the privacy. It's very important. With the GDPR even more, and it's the main afraid of bureaus. Data actions between public organizations. Yes, we have the základní registry, databases, but we have no culture and experience with the data exchange. We are not doing any exchange unless the strict law exchange, and use data as a real-time resource instead of just annual reports. I think this is the current situation in Czech Republic. We're just using annual reports, not real-time data for the benefit of all. Okay, and it's all for me.
Thank you. Mr. Profan was first because he needs to leave early. You are staying with us for
sometimes.
For some time. And now let's continue alphabetically, as I promised. Mr. Kopeček is here.
Yes.
Would you like to use PowerPoint or?
No, I just
no? Okay, great. So please have a seat.
Okay. So when can I react to the...
Yeah, we will have a plenary discussion after the panel, so we definitely have time for questions. Absolutely, that's the purpose of this, is to start, the topics and to move it into Czech context. That's the main ambition. Yes, please.
Okay.
The floor is yours.
Unlike Ondřej here, I'm not a member of parliament, so I hope I'll somehow manage to speak to this microphone. And I would like first to introduce myself. I'm from the Ministry of Finance, and Ministry of Finance started to publish data 3 years ago. We were actually the first ministry to publish data like open data in some professional, I would say semi-professional manner. And I would like to say that we are the institution that has the data. We have sections of institutions with systems full of data, and our problem is not that we wouldn't be able to get it. We actually have usually access to the databases, so there's no technical problem. While we started to publish open data, I was pleased to hear we had the very same problems like you mentioned. We had sections of ministry or units that would protect its monopoly for the data, and they wouldn't want to publish them. The main problem was that they were afraid they have errors in the data. So they wouldn't want to publish the open data, not because it would be against privacy law or it would be something that you could find some corruption or something. They were just worried that there are things missing. And they were telling us it's not possible to publish it because the data is not okay. And also one of the main things which I think unfortunately prevails is these people are hard to convince that we need to publish the very detailed microdata to be used for the academics. Because when we decided to do open data, we did an analysis of who will be the users, and unlike some of the international open data institutions that on the conferences told us that it's important to just publish it and not take care about what happens with the data, we think that there are several groups of people, one of which is the public, and that you can't just serve Excel file or a database for the public. You have to make some visualization or some application so that the knowledge, the information stored in that data actually gets to the public, because the public doesn't have the time or the skills to analyze the dataset. We also made, or are trying to make, the datasets to be a little bit user-friendly. So, I mean, in the way that we publish them in both, I would say, data formats for the scientists and for the academics, but we also want to publish them in Excel files with filters on, so that the data journalists can open the Excel file and do some basic filtering and write some news about it. And then there's the third group, that's the academics. Actually, there's a fourth group of the institution itself, which we did not expect. But then there's the fourth group of the academics, which are still not happy about our data, and I can see why, because the data is just not detailed enough, it's not in the correct formats, And that's, I would say, one challenge, so I'm really happy to be here because I see that it's possible, which I was almost not sure anymore. And you might ask, what are the problems? Why didn't we publish the data like our colleagues in Hungary here? So I would say, I think it's a lack of support, because when we first started open data, we actually got a really, really good impression from press. They told us that this is really good, this is really, something's changing here. Then we made some visualization apps and we got awards from some of the institutions, and we actually got an award from European Commission. So we would think that the people at the ministry, the politics, they would say, okay, this open data thing is really good and it's going to be great for our PR, let's put some money in it, let's put some people on it, let's do the open data like professionally. But that did not happen. Actually, we were a small team when we started. We were a small team of 2.5 FTEs, I would say, 2.5 people. And now I'm the only one in that team. But now I understand it sounds that I'm making alibis of why didn't I publish the data, because actually you're looking at the person that is responsible for publishing data at the Ministry of Finance. I'm the head of the Open Data project on the Ministry of Finance. And I agree, it's just an alibi that I don't have enough money and people. That's what you usually hear. So I would like to say that there is some work being done. We were planning on launching open data data warehouse, which don't think big. I'm one person, but it should come somehow. That's our plan for this year, actually, and it should somehow at least professionalize the way we gather the data, save them on one spot, and publish APIs for the people to download the detailed data from the system. And I would be very glad if part of this transfer mechanism would be anonymization, like we heard a few minutes earlier.
Thank you. Let me now invite Lenka Kováčová. I keep the alphabetic order just to be there's no hidden agenda here. Only the last. So, which one is this correct? Yes.
Okay.
Can you use the marker, or you can just wave and I can move?
Okay, I'm going to wave. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the invitation. My name is Lenka Kováčová. I'm from Open Society Fund Prague, and it's some kind of open data party in here because so many members of open data community from the Czech Republic. I didn't expect it, so maybe I'm going to repeat some information, and I'm sorry for that. But what is quite fascinating for me, that I was expecting that the similar problems as Ágota was showing in her presentation was just between the state and the citizens and the people. But it's very, very strange that the same problem, as I'm going to point at, are even between the institutions, and it's quite sad, I think. We in Open Society Fund Prague, for more than 6 years, we are dedicated to the work for the advocacy for open data in the Czech Republic, and I would like to show you how our fight with advocacy for open data as maybe as an inspiration. What we had to face to put open data in legislation, and what we are facing now, and maybe it's going to happen with administrative microdata too. So just to make you prepared for it. Wait, okay. Just to clarify, what's the difference between open data and administrative microdata? So we're not going to get confused during the discussion. From our perspective, open data is format. It's not a specific group of data, but it's a format how to work with published information. It's part of open government movement that promotes government transparency, that facilitates the communication between the states and between the citizens, and somehow encourage or should encourage public engagement. The open data are data that should be accessible to anyone and everyone, and should be available in a digital machine readable format. So JPEG, for example, is not digital machine readable format. They should be available for free, and they should be free from restriction on use and reuse. In Czech Republic, we have a law, finally, that is dedicated to open data. It's actually an amendment on Free Access to Information Act. And it has in itself the definition of the term open data, and moreover, it's established officially national catalog of open data. Actually, you cannot officially can talk about open data only if your data are in the national catalog of open data, and it's quite sad because the national catalog is off since December 2017. It's not working, or it's not being updated because of some internal problems at the Ministry of Interior, and it's quite tricky because it's in the this is in a legislation. You can see it in the presentation. However, this act, it's not saying to anyone to publish all data that are possible to be published on public as an open data. It's kind of definition, but the good thing is that to this law was attached a list of, at the beginning it was 11, or it still is 11 of data set that must be published as open data, and we hope this list is going to be updated. Just to show you what open data means, as you can see, open data are not private data, and that's one of the biggest mistakes or biggest argument that you can open private data. Yeah, we don't want to get private data open. It's not possible. And maybe I'm going to talk the most today about the open government data, not the publicly available data. But even if you're a business company, you can publish your information. You can publish your data as open data. The next slide, please. Yeah, thank you very much. 1,616 days. That is the time that was between the first mentioning of open data in the government's text. It was actually the action plan for open government till the legislation dedicated to the open data. It's quite a lot. Maybe not. But still, why this took so long? That's the questions. I prepared some timeline on the next slide, and you can see that it all began in the February, or for us, it began in February 2012, when the Open Society Fund was becoming with this project dedicated to open data and working with already a really very small open data community in the Czech Republic. Then that's the April 2012 when we have action plan for open government. That's actually the first mentioning of the open data. Then at the April 2014, the national catalog I was talking about like 2 minutes ago was launched. Now it's stopped, unfortunately. In the March 2016, so it was like more than 2 years after the first mentioning, the government prepared the amendment of Act of Free Access to Information, and then finally in September 2016 there was the president's signature. So if we are going to prepare some legislation or some act for the administrative microdata, maybe it's going to be a little bit longer than this one. What we were facing and what we still have to face, what it takes so long. Actually, now you can see that the arguments from the public institution, from the state, are quite similar to why not publish data between the institutions. One of it's no law, no open data. Many representatives of public administration just are going to say there's no law that is going to force me to do it, so I'm not going to do it. The thing is that because of the private data, because of the I don't know, trade secrets, etc., etc. But the thing is, there's no excuse not making the data that possibly are or can be open because of the law to open it as open data. The next argument is the data are not for everyone, and the data are ours, of certain ministries or certain agencies. So it's really, really similar argument. Again, like a lot of people says that there shouldn't be individuals or business companies making their own business or some kind of control upon this data, but they actually there's a lot of institutions that are using the application built of open data, or they're using the data as published as open data for public, because they cannot communicate between themselves, and they're quite happy that somebody else published this data. So it's very, very comfortable to use open data. Another thing is we cannot publish personal data. We don't want you to do it. They can be published by the law. So they cannot be open as open data because it cannot be open at all. That's all. There's nothing to say to it more. Another is the sphere of misinterpretation. It's a terrible word. There's fear that somebody is going to interpret the data wrongly or misinterpreted them. Actually, it's not happening a lot. And if you are afraid of it, just use metadata, the data about your data. Try to explain your data, visualize your data, put it in some context. Just explain it to the people so they're not going to misinterpret it. There are not like a bunch of people waiting for you to publish data and to make a scandal of it. The next one is very similar, and there's a fear of errors, and I think Andrzej was already talking about it. Like the state institutions are not sure about the accuracy of their data, and that's a big problem. Not even for open data, that's a big problem as itself, and they're afraid of some scandal. But it's good if they want to publish data, they have to just clean it. They have to check for the errors, and even if you are going to publish the data with the errors, don't be afraid. The people, the users of the data are usually expecting the high quality, so they're going to put your attention on this error so you can correct it, not to put it in some newspapers. And the last but not least is the task of money. Some public institution, it's not about like the costs to prepare the data for publishing of between the institutions or to public. But even there are some institutions that are making money on their data, and if they're going to publish as open, they lose this source of income. There's nothing to say to it. It's true and it's sad. There has to be some legislation or some political decision that can change it. But still, we can ask if it's really convenient to make money this way, because usually this is just a bunch of institutions that are selling their data to another state institutions, so it's like it's the same money still actually. What about the administrative data? My suggestion is, definitely there should be some law dedicated to administrative microdata. My suggestion is, if you are going to do it so they can be open, because we're going to increase economic and social benefits. We can find a new uses of this data. It's not going to be so hard, because for example, the statistical data are by their nature compatible with open data principles. Yeah, of course, we have to be really, really careful about the confidentiality, about the logistical issues, about the expected standards are high, that's this fear of error thing. But if they're going to be, like from the beginning, if in this legislation regarding administrative microdata are going to be, if we're going to take care that the institutions are going to adopt these open data standards for their daily routine, it should work very well. And if we are going to be very careful with the anonymization standards, because we cannot think about the people as a generator of the data, but we can still work with that. And if we are going to prepare great communication strategies toward the public, toward academic institutions, I think it should all work. That's my suggestion. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And now I'm looking with her on the list of panel participants, because I fell in my own trap. I invited Mr. Profant first because he needs to leave, and then I look on who is second on the list, and I jump over on the first on the list alphabetically, Jana Trlíková. So my sincere apology. It's my fault. So please, Jana Trlíková, head of the evaluation unit. Yes, please. Ministry of Regional Development of the Czech Republic. Whatever suits you best.
Yeah, I think I can use mine. That's easy.
if you prefer to stand, that's fine.
I think it's okay because everybody gets tired and maybe sleepy, so it's good if somebody from us will stand up, maybe a little bit cheer you up. Okay, so thank you very much for the invitation. My name is Jana Drlíková and I'm head of the evaluation unit of the National Coordinating Authority at the Ministry of Regional Development. I'm not sure how much you know about evaluation or about EU funds because that's where I work, but I'm from the people who can use much of the data, even administrative data or statistical data, and I would like to tell our story, what we can do and where are the problems for us. So can you just, next slide. Okay, just firstly I would like to explain what we do and why we do it. In the EU funds, the main important document is European Commission regulation. And for this programming period, 2014-2020, European Commission strengthen the role of evidence and result-based policy. European Commission did it by obligation that every member state have to do ex-ante evaluation as well as the evaluate result of its interventions. What does it mean? It helped us to create 12 evaluation units within the Czech Republic. My unit is one of these units and we try to coordinate the system and the rest of the evaluation units. Maybe the next slide. We should do impact or result-based evaluation. It means to see whether intervention had any impact or not. But as you can see on this graph, even in the past as well as in the present, the majority of work we do is process evaluation or some evaluation focus on publicity, etc., etc. The first graph is what we did in the previous programming period, and in the second graph, what we do now. The dark blue is the process evaluation, and you can see that still the process evaluation is the majority, even though the impact evaluation is rising. And I'll ask for the next slide why it is. I tried to speak also with my colleagues, so what's the problem, and I think I gathered three causes why we don't do more impact evaluation. The first problem is what my pre-speakers said already. We have a problem to read the microdata. You know, when you want to do impact evaluation, for example, contrafactual evaluation, you need a control group and a non-treatment group. And sometimes we have problem to reach the microdata collected by statistical office or even by our colleagues from other ministries. The second problem is there are differences between statistical data and the administrative data, and sometimes we don't know which data we can trust. Sometimes it's just about methodology, but sometimes there are different even administrative data, and these data are so different that you don't know which one are the correct one. Now we have problem in evaluation EU funds with it because of the indicators, because some colleagues at the beginning stated some target value of the indicators, and now when new colleagues try to figure out why this figure, where it came from, they cannot track back. And for example, we now see that we already achieved the target even though no intervention was done in the field. So you can see there are lots of problems even with the administrative data. And the third problem is the low trust in administrative data. I think something already was mentioned here. I have my own experience with, for example, health insurance data. That problem is that health insurance or social security office don't track your data based on the payments, but based on the paperwork you provide to the office. It means that, for example, when you look on the social security office data, they can still have you, they can have the information you are working for the company, you are not working like 6 months, because they have all data and it took time and there are lots of errors. Okay, the next slide. Not to be only pessimistic, I would like to show you one successful case. Our colleagues from Operation Program Employment, seated at the Ministry of Labor and Social Affairs. They managed to connect the data. The graph is a little bit difficult, but the point is they managed to connect the data which we are collecting by our monitoring system, the data about the target group, I mean concrete unemployed person who went through the intervention, and they collect these data with the register. Data from Labor Office, data from Czech Social Security Office, data from Population Register. They did it by ESSF. This technical system merged the data, and the evaluators and or administrators have anonymized with these hash codes data, and they can track whether the people who went through the intervention is employed after 6 months, after 1 year, etc., etc. There is the loophole in the story, of course. It's not so rosy. The work started back in 2010, so you can see it's 8 years, and until now it's not working well. There are still technical problems, and these 8 years was hard work of my colleagues to change the law, to have agreement from the office who they care about the personal data, and also to create this technical tool to be able to do it. But I spoke with them, and once this data will be proved, they can be opened, should be available even for other researchers. But until now, we cannot trust the data. Okay, the next slide. This is the last slide what I have for you, the way forward, not to be so pessimistic for the Friday, because we have a nice weekend ahead. The first, what I personally would like to do is to start the debate with Czech Statistical Office. If they are interested, maybe they are not, we will see. I think it's the right time for several reasons. First, I see that there is a willingness with my colleague who have a finance, who have money from OP technical assistant to finance some work of Czech Statistical Office, or to help them to finance, I don't know, building of a room, like data room, or etc. They have very nice evaluation recently from Poland, where they did it. They funded from EU funds their statistical office, and they really improved the way how they use the data in Poland. The second reason why I think it's right timing is we are preparing new programming period and new opportunities rising from this. And the last thing I would like to dedicate to this topic, like roundtable at our annual conference, evaluation conference, and to raise this topic also among evaluators or civil servants, and to start the discussion at least there. So this is from my side. Thank you very much, and if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to ask me, or I'm here also after the seminar. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm the last one standing before us and the discussion, so let me cut it short. But I will, please sit down. But I can't help myself to say a few words on top of what we have heard already. That's the user's perspective of researchers, and I will just emphasize what I already said, that merging is important. That's the key of the whole story. To do what now it's called the counterfactual impact evaluation. Counterfactual, yeah, whatever. Counterfactual impact evaluation. Or to use any kind of advanced statistical econometric methods to try to get somehow close to inferring on causality. One typically cannot do it with data only from one source, because not all the variables that are required are available. One can get lucky sometimes, but usually one needs to merge data from several sources. That's why merging through some point some place in the government that can do this merging, in Hungary, is absolutely crucial for using the data for this purpose. So open data, that's actually nice, but that wouldn't do the trick. That wouldn't help in the merging, because when it's open and anonymized from one source, one cannot merge it to the other sources, and that's the dead end for this kind of use. I have some examples that were already mentioned, like tracing people from the school system all the way to the labor market. Wouldn't that be wonderful if we can say something more about it than just impressions that we hear in the media and from policymakers? Many other examples, and not only from our fields that I can think of, but many other possible labor markets in general, how they work and the regulation, secondary basic education, social security systems and support, tax regulation and their impact, the field of criminology, pedagogy, gender studies, of course, gender imbalances about everything, health, that's big abroad in UK and US. These kind of studies. So there's a really big, wide area of studies which can be opened up if we have a system that will allow us to link data sets from different sources to be able to get to the variables that we need. We need to do the analysis and research. There's, of course, we need to strike the right balance that pop up several times between personal data protection and the need for due evidence-based policy. But the Hungarian case to me shows that there is not necessarily contradiction. If the data is merged and anonymized properly, then there should not be a big problem with personal data protection. So we don't have to choose one or the other. I think we can find a way to have a win-win solution for both to work. Then the other topic is and the distinction between the statistical data in the statistical office and this administrative data that we talk about today. It's good to make the distinction because, to start with, it's under different laws, but at the same time, 2 points. First, that also the Czech Statistical Office is increasingly using administrative data in their data work. So if one would just use statistical microdata from the office, there will be some gaps and holes because they are themselves filling in those holes by administrative data. So it's related. One from the other can be really distinguished, and increasingly so. And the second is that if there at some point is a safe room at the statistical office, perhaps that could be the place that can play the role of merging the data set from the administrative data. So there can be synergies with statistical office and administrative data. That's the future at some point, but I can see that those synergies clearly can be along the way. And then where I don't see any contradiction at all is whether this data should be used for research or evaluation. I believe for both, and both should actually benefit from each other. The main stumbling point, in my view, is that we will need a new legislation for merging the data. We already have free access to information that can perhaps facilitate access to individual sources of data, but the merging will need a new law. We probably cannot do without it. And that could be one big reason why it cannot be done. We will probably hear a million other reasons why this cannot be done. But let me say this, my answer is it can be done. Full stop. Let me open the floor with this remark. Yes?
Well, I'm Karol Gabala from the Ministry of Education, Youth and Sports. Well, my question is, I'm sorry. Yeah, my question is really targeting to my colleagues from the other administration units or ministries. Well, guys, do you see any will that it can be done? Like, in our ministry, we are now dealing with our own administration systems that we are trying to connect them, and this is the project that's supported from the European funds, and we are at this level, yeah? So, come on, what is your perspective to see that, it can be created new unit or new institution that can try to merge in the data from our databases?
It doesn't have to be a new institution.
Okay, of course, the mechanism, maybe.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a technical issue. That all can be done. This can be done. It has been proved, right? Things can be done. But if we start with reasons why this is not possible, we will never get anywhere, right? It can be done in Hungary. Therefore, if we are not talking about Sweden or Switzerland or Israel. We are talking about post-communist country that can do it. We can do better. Right?
So I just want to ask my colleagues if they see it like a possibility.
Yes, please.
Okay, I think what can help is exactly EU funds and the regulation, because I see that even in the future they will strengthen the importance of evidence, prove the results, and if we don't have the data we cannot tell anything. And the nice thing is that we have the finance to do this, but if we will have a will, I think this is a very tricky question, because it's not just about one person, you have to speak with many stakeholders. I'm not sure about administrative data, because every ministry has different law, and it's not one law, but mostly like several law. And as I said previously, my colleagues who try to just reach the microdata like from the Ministry of Labor, and they reach their own data from their own institutions. It is institutions, belong to the ministry. It took 8 years. So if you imagine you have to do with every ministry, it's like never-ending process probably, if there is no really political will. But maybe we can do something with the statistical data. I'm there a little bit more optimistic, but because at least it's one institution, but I don't know, we will see. We can speak together and try to raise the topic, I think, even with the public administration.
Let's go in a seating order so that I don't make any more mistakes. Ágota wants to speak, and then let's move, please.
Just a quick one. In the Hungarian case, there was no political will.
Okay.
Not at all. So and the issue was that since there was us in the finance ministry, and we had some colleagues like you, then in our 30s, and same in some ministries, and we kind of teamed up. And we looked at stakeholders, allies, potential allies, and none of the ministers. Okay, the prime minister probably thought it was nice, but he didn't make a huge effort to push it through. It was really us, and the only thing was that with the backing from the EU and with this general view of the government that they tried to look as like reasonable, evidence-based policy makers, etc. It would have been difficult for them to stop it. So there was the push, the pressure on our side, and nobody dared to stop us. Not that nobody tried. Some ministers really disliked the idea, and the statistical office didn't like it at all.
Okay, yes, please.
Okay, I would comment on the two things you said, that we don't need a law and that someone will tell you that it cannot be done. I think we don't need a law, and I think it can be done. However, I would slightly even disagree here with Ágota, because on our ministry, we also did basically the open data project because the political will was to publish invoices and contracts. And the fact that we did open data in the full, like the specifications of metadata and everything, was in fact internal. That was our decision. We had a team of 3 people which decided that we want to do something well. And we thought that open data are a project that cannot be stopped. I'm not sure anymore, because I think it cannot be stopped like that the minister would come and say, I'm closing the open data, because that would be totally bad for his PR. But it's possible not to support it for a long time, and when you cut the financing and the people, then you end up with a non-functioning project that will eventually just vanish. And so I think that we don't need law, but we really need some part of political will, because at least on our ministry, the money always comes with a political will. And therefore, yeah, yes. So I think we need a political will.
Another question? Yes, please.
Good afternoon. I would like to ask Ágota about the Hungarian office. How does it work? Is it doing anything proactive? Is it an open data hub in Hungary or something like that?
You mean the agency responsible for linking? Okay, no, they're not doing anything proactive. They're more like, I think their main function is IT management and maintenance of like a back office function for the ministries, and this is an additional task that they're also doing. They used to have, it depends on the person who's actually leading the small unit who is responsible for this task, and it's a unit of maybe 5 or 6 people, not more. And when this person is dedicated and interested, they're more proactive, but even then, no. So they just do the job if they ask them. But no, but this shouldn't be the case actually in other countries. It happened to be so in Hungary. I should also say, perhaps at this stage, that in most countries it would be the statistical office and not an IT unit within some ministry who is responsible for the linking. And I think it would make sense because it's not only an issue of IT, it's also a knowledge of statistics. And also the mandate of the statistical office is that they want to publish the data and inform the public. And you are unlikely to get the same enthusiasm within a government unit led by IT people. So I think it's not the best solution that it happens so in Hungary.
Yes, please. It's over there.
Thanks. I wanted to ask Ms. Deklikova, so you mentioned that the next step is to open discussion with the Czech Statistical Office, and that's the way to go. So should I understand it that you basically plan to try to access data from the Czech Statistical Office instead of pursuing the way to get data from the administrative data? Or and you also mentioned the Polish successful story, so I was more interested in that. Could you give us more details, or what was the plan and what was the Polish case?
Okay, thank you for the question. I think the statistical data are more correct one or trustful one for us, and in the past there were several attempts to speak with the statistical office, and for example, for a purpose of monitoring, we have some aggregate of statistical data for purpose of EU funds, for indicators. So yes, you are correct. I would like to start negotiate or start debate with statistical office if they are interested. For example, as I said, our colleagues from OP technical assistants are able to finance, I don't know, maybe people at the statistical office or maybe finance the technical room. So I think that's the way forward, because it will be good not just for us but also for researchers or our suppliers, that they can go to the room and do the research for us. And about the Polish case, what to say? The Polish colleagues managed to finance, as I said, some of the work they need for evaluation. The statistical office collected exactly the microdata. They merged the microdata for the purpose of evaluators, and this work is financed from EU funds, and also they finance some extra work that statistical office do search at the regional level, so they have more data, for example, at the regional level. So that's helped to to move the work with data in Poland.
Let me maybe add a few words on the top of this. We had a whole seminar about this issue last time, a month ago, and there was a statistical office present reacting, and it would be nice if they were today here. So we didn't invite them because this is a different issue. So I wouldn't maybe talk for them. It's up to the statistical office. Yeah. So let me just say one thing, which is important. I think this is not going to replace access to administrative data. It's compatible, but it won't replace it, because just if you look at the first mark, to study the labor market performance of university students after graduation, statistical office data, I don't see how that would really help with that. I mean, because for this, one needs to get access to the records of the universities, about the students, unemployment offices, social security data, maybe public register, right? So the key variables, from this wouldn't be found in statistical office data. And this more or less applies to most evaluations of particular public policies or programs. One needs to get access data from the program and from the data owner of the microdata from that program to do the evaluation. So the statistical office data is important. It can help. It can for especially research purposes. But particularly for evaluation and policy analysis, it cannot replace, in most cases, access to administrative data. And let me then pass the microphone to the statistical office.
If I can add, that's we, like my colleagues, managed to have the data from labor offices or social security system. So I think we moved there, and now it's, for example, what we are missing is microdata about companies. So that's why I'm thinking in this way. So
merging those together, yeah. That would be the ideal of the ideals. Yes.
Sorry, skipping your guest was asked. My name is Martin Zeleny. I'm from the Czech Statistical Office. I'm from the Demography and Social Statistics section, so not really too many aspects of what we have been talking about, because this was quite rich, and our institution was approached in many ways, in many different angles. So I will try to structure it a bit by being short, and then to make a few remarks. First, we have been discussing many different issues. For example, like access to the administrative data sources as such, for research and policy monitoring purposes, and merging of all, which is one level above. And in certain cases, we still have our homework to do as a country, even on the first level. So even the use of the individual administrative data sources, even for statistical purposes, is not fully operational. And getting access to the individual administrative data sources is not easy. But I have to admit, at least from our experience, that the climate is changing to the more better approach and better climate. But there are usually the technical reasons why this is difficult. It was mentioned that in some cases the data owners of administrative sources, they don't even have control over the databases because everything is outsourced. And then if you don't include the reporting and policy monitoring features into the system as such, then it's very difficult to finance any changes or any analysis. So my first remark would go into the direction we should think about the statistical and policy use even when we are creating the IT infrastructure and new administrative data sources. We are trying as a statistical office with our mandate to the limited extent we have as much as we can to promote this idea and to really be involved in as many things as we can be involved in administrative data sources so that this is not forgotten. For statistical purposes, but I think that this is quite similar to what the research and policy analysis needs. So when the features for statistical analysis is already built into the system and in new IT systems and so on, it's a good step for use of policy monitoring as well. Then we have been talking about data on persons, individual persons, on citizens, and we've been talking also about data on firms. These are also very different animals. Then what is important to mention, we've been talking about the administrative data sources. In this respect, we are somewhere in the middle between the real owners of the administrative data sources and you, most of you, as researchers and policy analysts, because we are not an institution that is a big holder of administrative data sources. We are also a user. Slightly different user for slightly different purposes, but we are also mainly the user of the administrative data, not the owner, not the creator. Except of two exceptions that are registered of census enumeration districts and generally get information about buildings. And then we have a register of economic subjects, economic bodies. And I think that we are relatively open in these two respects, because here we are the owners, so we have many information in public domains here. For data which we are not the owner of, it's more difficult, because we are user as you are, so we are not in a position to really grab the data and offer it as an open data. Our main task and main difficulty sometimes is to use it for statistical purposes per se. Then you have a statistical data, which I understand is the data that are collected for statistical purposes. And this is a big issue, because you have to think about that this is a completely different data for completely different reasons. So when you are collecting the administrative data, you can use it for policy analysis at the individual level. For statistical data collected as a statistical service for companies or for persons, you can never use it for individual evaluation purposes. No. This is completely against the spirit of the social statistical service, and this will never be possible. Then we are talking about possibility to use a control group and some aggregate analysis. There are some possibilities, but we cannot provide the data for individual companies for evaluation purposes for statistical surveys, and this will always be the case. I'm sorry for that, but this is really inherent into the statistical system. And this is not.
We had a whole seminar about this last time, so I'm sorry, but let's not go deep into this, because we talked about it for 2 hours.
The Safe Center will be only a part of the solution. I know that this is really being discussed, and I think that this is on the way. That it will increase the access to the data from statistical, but you will still have anonymized microdata. Yeah, so you will be able to use the firm data, but also even in the Safe Center, this will be an anonymized way, not in the firm data.
That's why it's important to figure out access emerging with administrative data. So there is framework that allows the owner of the administrative data to give it someone not anonymized, someone who will be tasked by the law to anonymize it and merge it and then anonymize it and then pass it, right? That's why it's key, to have a framework, legal framework for the owners of administrative data to pass it before anonymization to legally to second person.
So, for example, if you pass the information about the list of subjects of your control group and of the other group, and you will ask to create aggregated scores for different statistics to compare the two groups, this is possible at the aggregated level. Yeah? You can evaluate the program as a whole, but you will only be able to evaluate the performance of individual participants in the program. But that's probably a bit too details, and we can discuss it later. And then I know we have a homework to do in the way how we present the data in a user-friendly way, the aggregated data, and someone responsible for the population census to some extent. We will do our work, I think, and we will do our best to improve representation of the data so that it's more user-friendly. Because we are offering a lot of data, but I know that we have some limitations in the public domain, how user-friendly you can create more tables and things like that. It's fine, we know it, and we will do our best to improve it also. And then the last remark is for the census. I have seen
I'm sorry, but we need to give a floor to somebody else as well. It's administrative data, that's the topic.
There were too many topics open, so I'm able to answer some questions, not all of your questions afterwards. Sorry.
Yes, absolutely, we will have a chance for that. Let me just, one point on the top of this. You mentioned aggregated tabulations. That's one little step into finding some effect. One needs to really use more advanced methods to get anywhere close to inferring causality and doing the counterfactual impact evaluation. And that's why the analyst needs to get his hand on microdata. Without it, it wouldn't really leave anywhere close to answering the questions that I usually ask. And the whole problem is, as I see it, is that those middle steps are useful. So for example, the control group and the treatment group tabulations of this kind, or access to one source of the data. These are useful, but those really wouldn't allow to do the big thing. That's the whole point of it. To get into somehow credible analysis of the impacts. And for that, really, one needs to merge data from several sources and used advanced econometric and other methods to get to the, I would say, bingo point when you say, yes, I have the number that I'm confident enough to screaming out, you know, that was the impact. And without passing through this threshold, we are not really getting there, and researchers really wouldn't get interested in using the data if this threshold is not passed. Because for me personally, tabulations of this kind, my working day is maybe 8-10 hours per day. I will not spend that time with them. But if I can get closer to really answering the true question, then I can spend half year, 1 year of my life doing the analysis. Otherwise, I wouldn't be interested. So there's some threshold that we have to jump over to get anywhere. And unfortunately, it's a relatively big jump. But small steps wouldn't probably lead into there. That's the whole kind of problem, or the whole thing, that is through these small steps we will not see the value of doing it. We need to actually get to the point where we can show that it's for something. And that's the challenge, I would say. We are running out of time. We are out of time. I think we can take one more question if somebody has. Yes, done?
I have 3, so I will just want to ask later. For scientific research, especially social sciences, one needs not only to merge information for one individual from different sources, but also for one individual to other parents, let's say. Does the Hungarian system allow for that? Because there is probably one source of information only who says who is the father or mother of a given person. So this is my technical question.
But that's an issue of how the administrative data is constructed. So in some countries you do have more possibilities for this. In Hungary it's relatively limited. In some cases you can link couples because we have tax rules about the child tax credits, and for that reason the tax authority needs to know who are the parents of a certain child that you want to use this credit for. And theoretically, you could also use the information on which I think all countries have, the database for residents, in which you can find where people live and all the households. We've never tried to use that because it's not as the potential for mistakes in the data is much higher. If you look at the social security number, usually that's relatively clean in all the data. If you start using addresses, mistakes, the potential for mistakes increases. So theoretically you could do it. I don't think anybody's tried to do it using the household level. For the various bits of information on typically the mother can be drawn from some of the data sets. But it is a big limitation, I agree.
Okay, we have small refreshment. So there's also a chance to continue with the discussion. If you don't need to run at home, please join us for. It's over there. Yes, over there, right here. Otherwise, thank you very much for coming.